Butch Burroughs, who witnessed the arrest, startled me in his interview by saying he saw a second arrest occur in the Texas theater only 3 or 4 minutes later. That's a quote, only 3 or 4 minutes later. He said the Dallas police then arrested, quote, an Oswald look-alike. Burroughs said the second man, quote, looked almost like Oswald, like he was his brother or something. Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess, Connell, and if you're new, then welcome. I'd love to earn your subscription today. Well, a couple of quick updates. Number one is I do have AC. It feels amazing. I'm sleeping with blankets again, so very grateful for that this week. And the other thing, you guys, I'm just going to share because it's so cute. We had baby chicks hatch over the weekend, so we are in, happy, clappy chick mode right now where everybody is just oohing and awing over the new baby chicks. So I just thought I would share that with you because they're so cute. The other things, of course, are that in November we have conferences coming up for JFK. And so if you would like to come, I would love to invite you to the JFK Historical Conference. That will be happening in Dallas in November. You can see the screenshot of the information there, and you can check the show notes for more information. Additionally, if you are interested in going to the Lancer conference, I have a discount code for you. It is JFK10, and it will give you 10% off of whichever package you desire to do, even from a distance. If you purchase the, online package, and then maybe they send you MP3s or videos of that. I don't understand how all that works, but even that, it'll give you 10% off. So whatever of those that you can attend or listen to, I think we will all learn a lot from those conferences, and I'm really looking forward to that. So yeah, if I get to see you there, that would be very fun. Today we actually have something that I didn't give you a heads up about, but we are going to read from another section of JFK and the Unspeakable. We actually began this entire series with this book, and I would say it was a very philosophical, heady, get your understanding of the state of the world sort of reading, whereas today's reading is much more practical and informational. But I think it's going to be interesting to see how his tone still carries through even when he is delivering practical, detailed information. We're going to be reading about the arrest of Lee Harvey Oswald, and we're going to start just right after the section that we just read about, which was Tippet's murder. Let's jump right in. Warren Commission counsel David Bellin wrote, "The Rosetta Stone to the solution of President Kennedy's murder is the murder of Officer JD Tippit." Now, for those of us who grew up in the book era, we may all know what Rosetta Stone is. However, I'm not only making these videos for us, I'm making them for anyone who comes along, including younger people who increasingly are not being educated well about history. So let me explain very briefly about the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone, of course, was a big slab that had 3 different languages on it, and it had I believe a proclamation in 3 different languages, one of which was Egyptian hieroglyphics. And until that point, we could not translate Egyptian hieroglyphics. So the Rosetta Stone basically unlocked that language for us. And so Warren Commission counsel David Bellin, what he's advocating for is that if you understand the JD Tippit murder, then you'll understand President Kennedy's murder. From the Warren Commission standpoint, the killing of Tippit, who presumably challenged the assassin's flight after he killed Kennedy, was said to prove that Oswald had the capacity to kill. Warren Commission critic Harold Weisberg saw Tippit's murder instead as the government's way of poisoning the public mind against Lee Harvey Oswald. Quote, "Immediately, the flimsy police case against Oswald required a willingness to believe. This was provided by affixing to Oswald the opprobrious epithet of cop killer." So the killing of Tippit becomes sort of the foundation on which they can rest the idea that, well, if he killed once, he'll kill again. Obviously, he killed the president because once he fled to Oak Cliff, he killed that cop, right? It provided a level of gravitas that in the moment sold the story. We're going to skip ahead a few pages because I want to get past the Tippit murder toward the arrest of Lee Oswald. So Douglas takes us through multiple witnesses and talks through the Tippit situation. And he says the fleeing man, who was identified later as Oswald, was seen finally by Johnny Calvin Brewer, manager of Hardy's shoe store, located a few doors east of the Texas Theater. After spotting the man acting suspiciously in the recessed area in front of his store, Brewer went outside. So Brewer sees a man acting suspiciously, and it's one of those stores that has kind of like old-timey stores that has a little foyer that you can stand in out and not be in the rain and browse the windows, right? And so he sees a man hanging out in that little area, in the recessed area, and he goes outside. He saw the man ducking into the theater up the block. The ticket seller, Julia Postal, confirmed to Brewer that the man had not bought a ticket. She called the police. However, the man who shot Tippit fled the murder scene, sneaked into the Texas Theater just before 1:45 p.m., and was identified as Lee Harvey Oswald, posed another by-location problem. Once again, Oswald seemed to be in two places at the same time. According to Warren H. Butch Burroughs, the concession stand operator at the Texas Theater, Lee Harvey Oswald entered the theater sometime between 1 p.m. and 1:07, several minutes before Officer Tippit was slain 7 blocks away. If true, Butch Burroughs' observation would eliminate Oswald as a candidate for Tippit's murder. Perhaps for that reason, Burroughs was asked by a Warren Commission attorney the apparently straightforward question, "Did you see Oswald come in the theater?" And answered honestly, "No, sir, I didn't." What someone reading this testimony would not know is that Butch Burroughs was unable to see anyone enter the theater from where he was standing at his concession stand, unless that person came into the area where he was working. As he explained to me in an interview, there was a partition between his concession stand and the front door. Someone could enter the theater, go directly up a flight of stairs to the balcony, and not be seen from the concession stand. That, Burroughs said, is what Oswald apparently did. However, Burroughs still knew that Oswald had come into the theater between 1 and 1:07 because he saw him inside the theater soon after that. As he told me, he sold popcorn to Oswald at 1:15 p.m. Information that the Warren Commission did not solicit from him in his testimony. When Oswald bought his popcorn at 1:15 p.m., this was the exact same time that the Warren report said Officer Tippit was being shot to death, evidently by someone else. Butch Burroughs was not alone in noticing Oswald in the Texas Theater by then. The man who would soon be identified as the president's assassin drew the attention of several moviegoers because of his odd behavior. Edging into a row of seats in the right rear section of the ground floor, Oswald had squeezed in front of 18-year-old Jack Davis. He then sat down in the seat right next to him. Because there were fewer than 20 people in the entire 900-seat theater, Davis wondered why the man chose such close proximity to him. Whatever the reason, the man didn't stay there long. Oswald, as Davis would later identify him, got up quickly, moved across the aisle, and sat down next to someone else in the almost deserted theater. In a few moments, he stood up again and walked out to the lobby. Davis thought it obvious that Oswald was looking for someone, yet it must have been someone he didn't know personally. He sat next to each new person just long enough to receive a prearranged signal, in the absence of which he moved on to another possible contact. Some people have surmised, and perhaps it's going to get into this, that Oswald may have possessed some sort of key. For example, if I had this side of the pen and someone else comes and has the exact same one and we can fit them together, then we know we are the ones who are to meet each other. some sort of key like that, or perhaps a phrase, something by which he could know this was the trusted contact that he was supposed to meet at that moment. Back out in the lobby at 1:15 p.m., Oswald then bought his popcorn from Butch Burroughs at the concession stand. Burroughs told author Jim Mars and myself that he saw Oswald go back in the ground floor of the theater and sit next to a pregnant woman in another apparently fruitless effort to find his contact. Several minutes later, the pregnant woman got up and went to the ladies' washroom, which would be exactly what you would do if you were a pregnant lady and some random guy just came up and sat right next to you. You'd be like, okay, this is weird. I don't feel safe. I mean, why was she in a place that had a war movie going by herself anyway? I don't know. But if I was a pregnant lady and some random guy came up and sat next to me, I probably would excuse myself to go to the restroom as well. Burroughs heard the restroom door close just shortly before Dallas police came rushing into the theater. Jack Davis said it may have been 20 minutes or so after Oswald returned from the lobby when Burroughs saw Oswald sit by the pregnant woman that the house lights came on and the police rushed in. So we're talking about an extended length of time. We have him potentially there between 1 and 1:07. Then he's seen in the theater. He's changing seats. He goes out and buys popcorn, and Jack Davis says 20 minutes passes, which is exactly right because he's arrested, I believe, around 1:45. So we have him there way sooner than he should be there. We do have a double Oswald problem here. The police arrested Oswald in a curious way. They entered the theater from the front and the back, blocking all exits and surrounding Oswald. Well, that doesn't surprise me. If you thought he had killed a cop, even if it was just a cop, you would make sure he couldn't get out any other random way. Officer M.N. McDonald and 3 other officers came in from behind the movie screen. With the theater lights on, McDonald scanned the audience. Johnny Brewer, who had seen the man who looked like Oswald duck into the theater, showed McDonald where the man was sitting, in the 3rd row from the rear of the ground floor. So we have a sighting, a man who observes him in that little recessed area. He's the same guy that he saw, and he says that's him. Okay. With the suspect identified and located, McDonald and an accompanying officer, instead of apprehending the man in the rear of the theater, began searching people between him and them. As the police proceeded slowly toward Oswald, it was almost as if they were provoking the suspected police killer to break away from his seat. His attempt to escape would have given Tippet's enraged fellow officers an excuse to shoot him. When McDonald finally reached his suspect in the 3rd row from the back, Oswald stood up and pulled out his pistol. While he struggled with McDonald and the other officers who had converged on the scene, they heard the snap of the hammer on his gun misfiring. However, Oswald, instead of being shot to death on the spot, was wrestled into submission by the police and placed under arrest. The police hustled him out to a squad car. They drove him to Dallas Police Headquarters in City Hall. Butch Burroughs, who witnessed the arrest, startled me in his interview by saying he saw a second arrest occur in the Texas theater only 3 or 4 minutes later. That's a quote, only 3 or 4 minutes later. He said the Dallas police then arrested, quote, an Oswald look-alike. Burroughs said the second man, quote, looked almost like Oswald, like he was his brother or something. When I questioned, so this is the author, when I questioned the comparison by asking, quote, could you see the second man as well as you could see Oswald? He answered, yes, I could see both of them. They looked alike. After the officers half carried and half dragged Oswald to the police car in front of the theater, within a space of 3 or 4 minutes, Burroughs saw the second Oswald placed under arrest and handcuffed. The Oswald look-alike, however, was taken by police, not out the front, but out the back of the theater. What happened next, we can learn from another neglected witness, Bernard Hare. Bernard Hare, that's H-A-I-R-E, was the owner of Bernie's Hobby House, just 2 doors east of the Texas Theater. Hare went outside his store when he saw the police cars congregating in front of the theater. When he couldn't see what was happening because of the crowd, he went back through his store into the alley out back. It too was full of police cars, but there were fewer spectators. So he walked up the alley. When he stopped opposite the rear door of the theater, he witnessed what he would think for decades was the arrest of Lee Harvey Oswald. Quote, police brought a young white man out. The man was dressed in a pullover shirt and slacks. He seemed to be flushed as if he'd been in a struggle. Police put the man in the police car and drove off. When Hare was told in 1987 that Lee Harvey Oswald had been brought out the front of the theater by police, he was shocked. I don't know who I saw arrested, he said in bewilderment. Butch Burroughs and Bernard Hare are complementary witnesses. From their perspectives, both inside and outside the Texas Theater, they saw an Oswald double arrested and taken to a police car in the back alley only minutes after the arrest of Lee Harvey Oswald. Burroughs's and Hare's independent, converging testimonies provide critical insight into the mechanics of the plot. In a comprehensive intelligence scenario for Kennedy's and Tippet's murders, the plan culminated in Oswald's Friday arrest and Sunday murder, probably a fallback from his being set up to be killed in the Texas Theater by the police. So, do you see what that's saying? It's saying they maybe intended to kill him, that maybe he would run and then they would have a reason to shoot him because he was fleeing arrest. But because instead he stood up and he said, I'm not resisting arrest. I'm not resisting arrest. They had to take him out front and then they take their guy out back. Now, why was the second guy there? It's a good question. There's a hint of the second Oswald's arrest in the Dallas police records. Robert Groden shared this with us in that Pat Hall video. According to the DPD's official homicide report, quote, suspect was later arrested in the balcony of the Texas Theater at 231 West Jefferson. Dallas police detective L.D. Stringfellow also reported to Captain Ganaway, quote, Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested in the balcony of the Texas Theater, end quote. To whom are the homicide report and Detective Stringfellow referring? Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested in the orchestra, not the balcony. Are these documents referring to DPD's second arrest at the Texas Theater that afternoon? It would seem so. Was Butch Burroughs witnessing an arrest of the Oswald look-alike that actually began in the balcony? That would have likely been the double's hiding place after he entered the theater without paying, thereby drawing attention to himself and leading the police to the apprehension of his likeness, Lee Harvey Oswald, who was already inside. So the assertion here is that the double purposefully drew attention to himself in order to lead the police to the theater. To think this, you'd have to think either they knew that that was going to be a place that Lee Oswald would try to meet his contact, or they had actually been the ones somehow to communicate to him that he should go there. So then they've got to lead the man who looks like him to draw attention and then go up and hide in the balcony. And then why the second arrest? I don't understand that part. So if one of y'all can explain that to me, I don't understand why he had to be arrested and taken out back rather than just quietly like slipping out. As Butch Burroughs had already pointed out, anyone coming from the front of the theater could immediately head upstairs to the balcony without being seen from the concession stand. The Oswald double, after having been put in the police car in the alley, must have been driven a short distance and released on higher intelligence orders. Unfortunately for the plotters, he was seen again soon. With the scapegoat Lee Harvey Oswald now safely in custody, we can presume that the double was not supposed to be seen in Dallas again or anywhere else. Had he not been seen, the CIA's double Oswald strategy in an Oak Cliff shell game might have eluded independent investigators forever. But thanks to other key witnesses who have emerged, we now have detailed evidence that the double was seen again, not just once, but twice. Okay, you guys, I'm really loving his style. This is a very different feel than how we started the series. It is very punchy and active, and I really like the way he's bringing the facts for us. I do also want to tell you that probably almost every paragraph or every few paragraphs, there are citations. And sometimes there are like 5 citations in one paragraph. So this book, as you might remember, it starts around here, but it has a whole thick section of hundreds of citations of various radio interviews, books. It is a very academic level of citation. So the things that are being written here are very trustworthy. They're not just somebody talking off the cuff and kind of throwing things together. This is someone who has taken articles and interviews and data points and is coalescing them for us in a way that makes sense of the story. And I'm really enjoying it. I hope you are too. At 2 p.m., as Lee Harvey Oswald sat handcuffed in the back seat of a patrol car boxed in by police officers on his way to jail, Oswald knew what final role had been chosen for him in the assassination scenario. That night, while being led through police headquarters, he would shout out to the press, "I'm just a patsy." Also at about 2 p.m., a man identified as Oswald was seen in a car 8 blocks away from the Texas Theater, still very much at large and keeping a low profile. A sharp-eyed auto mechanic spotted him. T.F. White was a 60-year-old longtime employee of Mac Pate's garage in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas. While White worked on an automobile the afternoon of the assassination, he could hear the police sirens screaming up and down Davis Street, only a block away. He also heard radio reports describing a suspect then thought to be in Oak Cliff. The mechanic looked out the open doors of the garage. He watched as a red 1961 Falcon drove into the parking lot of the El Chico restaurant across the street. The Falcon parked in an odd position after going a few feet into the lot. The driver remained seated in the car. White said later, the man in the car appeared to be hiding. White kept his eye on the man in the Falcon, which you would. If you're an old guy and you're listening to your radio and you're working, but then you notice a guy you've never seen and he seems to be hunkering down and you know that the suspect is there. You know, I think men in particular have the drive to protect. But men, particularly Texan men at this time period, absolutely saw themselves as society's protectors, as the guards of what gets through my neighborhood. You're not getting into my house, and they had the guns to back themselves up. T.F. White walked across the street to investigate. I like this guy. He halted about 10 to 15 yards from the car. He could see the driver was wearing a white T-shirt. The man turned toward White and looked at him full face. White stared back at him. Not wanting to provoke a possible assassin, White began a retreat to his garage. However, he paused, took a scrap of paper from his coveralls pocket, and wrote down the Texas license plate of the car, PP4537. That night, while T.F. White was watching television with his wife, he recognized the Dallas Police Department's prisoner, Lee Harvey Oswald, as the man that he had seen in the Red Falcon in El Chico's parking lot. White was unfazed by what he did not yet know, that at the same time he had seen one Oswald sitting freely in the Falcon, the other Oswald was sitting handcuffed in a Dallas police car on his way to jail. So he didn't realize the discrepancy, of course. You wouldn't. Mrs. White, fearing the encompassing arms of a conspiracy, talked her husband out of reporting his information to the authorities. Thus, the Oswald sighted in the parking lot might have escaped history, but for the fact that White was confronted by an alert reporter. On December 4th, 1963, so a couple weeks after the assassination, Wes Wise, a Dallas newscaster whose specialty was sports, gave a luncheon talk to the Oak Cliff Exchange Club at El Chico's restaurant. At the urging of his listeners, he changed his topic from sports to the president's assassination, which Wise had covered. He described to his luncheon audience how he, as a reporter, had become part of Jack Ruby's story. Wise's encounter with the man he knew as a news groupie came on the grassy knoll the day before Ruby shot Oswald. Wise had just completed a somber day after the assassination radio newscast from the site banked with wreaths. So we're back on November 23rd. He's at the grassy knoll. He's a reporter and he's doing a radio newscast. While he sat in his car in silent reflection beside the Texas School Book Depository, he heard a familiar voice call out, "Hey, Wes." As Wise told the story, quote, "I turned to see the portly figure of a man in a dark suit, half waddling, half trotting as he came toward me." Hearing descriptions of Jack Ruby, this seems to be the best one I've heard yet. He was wearing a fedora-style hat, which would later become familiar and famous. Jack Ruby was making his way along the grassy knoll, quote, "from the direction of the railroad tracks." Precisely where the day before, as Ed Hoffman watched, another man in a suit had fired a rifle at the president. An hour and a half after, Julia Ann Mercer saw a man dropped off by Jack Ruby carrying a rifle up the same site. So we have this dot to dot to dot that he is giving us of he's coming in the same exact path that just completes that up the hill with the rifle to the fence, and then now coming right around there by the Texas School Book Depository. Ruby leaned into Wise's car window and said, his voice breaking and with tears in his eyes, "I just hope they don't make Jackie come back to Dallas for the trial. That would be terrible for that little lady." In retrospect, Wise wondered if Ruby was trying to set him up for a radio interview to go on record the day before with his famous motive for murdering Oswald. Although Wise had no interest then in interviewing Jack Ruby, he had already just been told enough for him to be called as a witness in Ruby's trial. He would be subpoenaed as a Ruby witness by both the prosecution and the defense. His testimony at the trial, quoting what Ruby said to him the day before Ruby murdered Oswald, would then be cited in Life magazine. At the end of Wise's talk to his absorbed audience at the Oak Cliff Exchange Club, Mac Pate, who had walked across the street from his garage to listen, that's the man who owned the garage where Mr. White worked, he told Wise about the mechanic having seen Oswald. Wise asked to go immediately with Pate to speak with his employee. As Wes Wise told me in an interview 4 decades later, he then, quote, put a little selling job on Mr. White to reveal what he had seen. Wise said to the reluctant auto mechanic, "Well, you know, we're talking about the assassination of the President of the United States here." Convinced of his duty, T.F. White took Wise into El Chico's parking lot and walked him step by step through his full-face encounter with Oswald. Wise realized the car had been parked at the center of Oswald's activity in Oak Cliff that afternoon, 1 block from where Oswald got out of his taxi, 6 blocks south of his rooming house, 8 blocks north of his arrest at the Texas Theater, and only 5 blocks from Tippet's murder on a route in between. Taking notes on his luncheon invitation, Wise said, "I just wish you had gotten the license number." White reached in his pocket and took out a scrap of paper with writing on it. He handed it to Wise. "This is it," he said. Newscaster Wes Wise notified the FBI of White's identification of Oswald in the car parked in the El Chico lot and cited the license plate number. FBI agent Charles T. Brown, Jr., reported from an interview with Milton Love in the Dallas County Tax Office, quote, 1963 Texas license plate PP4537 was issued for a 1957 Plymouth automobile in possession of Carl Amos Mather, and gives his address. Agent Brown then drove to that address and reported that the 1957 Plymouth bearing that license plate number was parked in the driveway of Mather's home in Garland, a suburb of Dallas. Thus arose the question of how a license plate for Carl Amos Mather's Plymouth came to be seen on the Falcon in El Chico's parking lot with a man in it who looked like Oswald. Okay, so we have a Falcon and then a 1957 Plymouth. So why was the license plate on the Falcon? And now that license plate is back on the Plymouth. The FBI had also discovered that Carl Amos Mather did high security communications work for Collins Radio, a major contractor with the Central Intelligence Agency. Okay, you guys, I have to tell you, if you haven't checked out Ted Yakuchi's channel, you should. He is a researcher into the JFK assassination. He does fabulous deep dives onto specific topics. And I believe last week he did a deep dive into the Collins Radio Company and their intelligence connections. So you may want to go and check that out because it's worth listening to. And he does a whole look at the bigger picture of this exact detail. 3 weeks before Kennedy's assassination, Collins Radio had been identified on the front page of the New York Times as having just deployed a CIA raider ship on an espionage and sabotage mission against Cuba. Collins also held the government contract for installing communications towers in Vietnam, so they do all sorts of radio and transmission work for the CIA. In 1971, Collins Radio would merge with another giant military contractor, Rockwell International. In November 1963, Collins was at the heart of the CIA military contracting business for state-of-the-art communications systems. So why would that vehicle and that license plate with that connection be seen at that time by this man? And I want to remind you, when we encounter salt-of-the-earth people who have no reason to make up their particular data point, whether it's Lee Bowers or Aquila Clemens or this man, Mr. T.F. White, when average Joe people who really don't want to be involved and are a little bit reluctant to speak, but they speak with clarity and they give us details that are significant, we need to pay attention. That's what he's done. Carl Mather had represented Collins at Andrews Air Force Base by putting special electronics equipment in Vice President Lyndon Johnson's Air Force Two plane. Given the authority of his CIA-linked security clearance, Carl Mather refused to speak to the FBI. The FBI instead questioned his wife, Barbara Mather, who stunned them. Her husband, she said, was a good friend of JD Tippit. In fact, the Mathers were such close friends of Tippit and his wife that when JD was murdered, Marie Tippit phoned them. According to his wife, Carl Mather left work that afternoon at 3:30 and returned home. Carl and Barbara Mather then drove to the Tippit home where they consoled Marie Tippit on the death of her husband, killed by a man identical to the one seen a few minutes later, 5 blocks away in a car bearing the Mathers' license plate number. Whoa. It makes you wonder what all is happening here. What is the connection between the Mathers and JD Tippit and this secondary Oswald figure? And I know what y'all are going to tell me. Many of y'all are going to comment, you need to check out John Armstrong's work on Harvey and Lee. And I do. So if one of y'all want to send me a copy of the book, you can. Otherwise, we'll wait until I can afford a copy of the book. Which, even if I had a copy of the book, I'm not going to read it all here on the channel. But I do want to get into his work. I have been listening to some of his videos. If you haven't, you do want to check out John Armstrong. He has some interesting ideas about this two Oswalds situation. And he breaks it down with photos and with storytelling and with timelines that in a helpful way. It is still confusing, I have to warn you. But this one in particular is very interesting to me, that there's this second Oswald who apparently would have been arrested from the balcony, taken out the back door, end up in a Falcon across the street from this mechanic, and he ducks down in the seat. Now, why did they stop there? Did somebody else go into El Chico? I'm not clear on what's happening here. But whatever's happening, he's there. He's seen by this man who just gingerly writes down the license plate and doesn't speak of it. for a couple weeks. Then Wes Wise gets a whiff of it. Well, 15 years after the assassination, Carl Mather finally did consent to an interview for the first time with the HSCA, but on condition that he be granted immunity from prosecution. The electronics specialist could not explain how his car's license plate number could have been seen on the Falcon with its Oswald-like driver in the El Chico lot. The HSCA dismissed the incident as, quote, the Wise allegation, in which a confused auto mechanic had jotted down a coincidentally connected license plate as alleged by a reporter. Yeah, if you can put distance, well, it's alleged by this reporter that this one man, he jotted down a number 2 weeks earlier. You know, who knows if it's true. That's how they did. The odds against White having come up with the exact license plate of a CIA-connected friend of JD Tippit were too astronomical for comment and were given none. Right. What kept the Wise allegation from sinking into total oblivion over the years was the persistent conscience of Wes Wise, who in 1971 was elected mayor of Dallas. During his 2 terms, he guided Dallas out from under the cloud of the assassination and at the same time saved the Texas School Book Depository from imminent destruction, preserving it for future research into the president's murder. In the fall of 2005, I interviewed Wes Wise, who recalled vividly T.F. White's description of his confrontation with a man looking like Oswald in the El Chico parking lot. Wise said he was so struck by the incident that he returned to the El Chico lot on a November 22nd afternoon years later to reenact the scene with similar lighting and a friend sitting in an identically parked car. Standing on the spot where T.F. White had, and with the same degree of afternoon sunlight, Wise confirmed that one could easily recognize a driver's features from a full-face look at that distance, irrespective of whether the car's window was up or down. What a good thing that he went back on November 22nd at 2 p.m. just to verify that. That's a researcher's mind right there. The possible significance of what he had learned stayed with Wise during his years as a reporter and as Dallas mayor, in spite of its repeated dismissal. Knowing the value of evidence, Mayor Wise preserved not only the Texas School Book Depository, but also the December 4th, 1963 luncheon invitation on which he had immediately written down T.F. White's identification of the license plate on the Oswald's car. Producing it from his files during our interview, Wise read to me over the phone T.F. White's exact identification of the license plate, as the auto mechanic had shown it to the reporter on the scrap of paper taken from his coveralls. At the end of our conversation, Mayor Wise reflected for a moment on the question posed by Lee Harvey Oswald's presence elsewhere at the same time as T.F. White saw him in the El Chico parking lot, in a car whose license plate could now be tracked thanks to the scrupulous note-taking of White and Wise, now to the employee of a major CIA contractor. Here was Wise's response. Well, you're aware of the idea of 2 Oswalds, I guess? So that was Wes Wise's response of how he squared the idea that one Oswald was in this Falcon at the same time that the Oswald that we know was on his way to the Dallas Police Department. I was especially aware of, quote, the idea of 2 Oswalds from the testimony of U.S. Air Force Sergeant Robert G. Vincent of the North American Air Defense Command, NORAD. Vincent not only saw the second Oswald on the afternoon of November 22nd, soon after T.F. White did, he actually witnessed the Oswald double escaping from Dallas on a CIA plane. Sergeant Vincent was already on the CIA getaway plane when the second Oswald boarded it. Vincent also got off the plane at the same CIA base as Oswald's double did, a few moments after him. Robert Vincent is a unique witness to the CIA's secret movement of an Oswald double out of Dallas on the afternoon of the assassination. On November 20th, 1963, Sergeant Robert Vincent took a trip to Washington, D.C. His purpose was about his military career. On Thursday, November 21st, in a basement office of the Capitol building, Sergeant Vincent met with a Colonel Chapman, who served as a liaison officer between Congress and the Pentagon. While he looked over Vincent's papers, Chapman engaged in a phone conversation Vincent would not forget. Colonel Chapman told the person on the other end of the line he, quote, would highly recommend that the president not go to Dallas, Texas on Friday because there had been something reported. Chapman said the president should cancel his Dallas trip, even though an advance group of congressmen whom Chapman was coordinating had already left the Capitol. Vincent did not hear what the something was that moved Colonel Chapman to urge the last-second cancellation of President Kennedy's Dallas trip. That would have followed by less than 3 weeks the last-second cancellation of his Chicago trip, where a 4-man sniper team and an assassination scapegoat had been discovered. That is something that, if you're not aware of it, you do want to be, that a few weeks prior to Dallas, there was an identical assassination planned. A 4-man team, an assassination scapegoat who highly resembles the person of Oswald. He was a former Marine. He had been at Atsugi, I believe, the same base that Oswald had been at. He certainly had been at Japan. They were trained in very similar ways. And if you want more information about that, again, I'll point you to Ted Yakuchi. I think he did a recent video about the Chicago plot. So that is one worth knowing about because it provides a similar picture that these plots had been planned in Florida and in Chicago and now the successful one in Dallas. Colonel Chapman referred Sergeant Vincent's promotion question to an officer at the Pentagon, and they look into it. So the next day, November 22nd, Vincent took a bus to Andrews Air Force Base. He planned to hitch a ride home on the first available flight, going to Colorado Springs or its vicinity. When an airman at the check-in counter told him there was nothing scheduled that day going that way, Vincent still wrote his name and serial number on the check-in sheet. He said he was going for breakfast in the cafeteria and asked the airman to let him know if anything should come through. A loudspeaker paged him 15 minutes later. He left his breakfast sitting on the table, grabbed his bag, and ran for a plane that was pointed out by the airman, who said it was about to depart for Lowry Air Force Base in Denver. The plane down the runway that Vincent climbed aboard was a propeller-driven C-54, a large cargo plane. Unlike all the other planes Vincent had hitched a ride on, the C-54 bore no military markings or serial numbers. Its only identification was on its tail, a rust-brown graphic of an egg-shaped Earth, crossed by white grid marks. The plane's door was open. When Vincent got in the C-54, he found it empty. He took a seat over the right wing. Through the window, he could see 2 men in olive drab coveralls walking around under the plane. Their coveralls bore no markings. In a minute, the 2 men got on the plane. They walked past Vincent without saying a word, then closed the cockpit door. The engine started up, and the plane took off. Looking out the window at the runway disappearing beneath them, Vincent reflected on the flight's strange beginning and his own anonymity. Whenever he had hitched a ride before with the Air Force, the crew chief had always asked him to sign the manifest or the log. This flight didn't even have a crew chief, much less a manifest. Nor did the pilot or co-pilot, if that's what this second man in the cockpit was, give him a usual friendly greeting. His reception had been total silence from the 2 men now flying the C-54 due west. At a location Vincent thought was somewhere over Nebraska, he suddenly heard an unemotional voice say over the intercom, "The president was shot at 12:29. Immediately after the flatly given announcement, the plane banked into a sharp left turn. It began heading south. About 3:30 p.m. Central Time, Vincent saw on the horizon the skyline of a city he was familiar with, Dallas. The plane turned and came in over Dallas in a southeast direction. It landed abruptly in a rough, sandy area alongside the Trinity River. It was not a runway. Vincent thought it looked like a road under construction. Dust blew up as the C-54 taxied around in a U-turn and came to a stop. The engines kept running. Through the window, Vincent saw a tool shed of the type used by highway construction crews, perhaps 4 by 6 feet in size, in a large, open, sandy area. Low cliffs stood at a distance. Across the river to the north was the Dallas skyline. 2 men were running toward the plane from a jeep, which then backed out of Vincent's sight. One of the plane's pilots came back and unlatched the passenger door. The 2 men came aboard. Vincent watched as the men passed his seat without looking or speaking to him. They were wearing off-white, beige coveralls, the type used by highway workers. They carried nothing. The men sat down right behind the cockpit. They said nothing to the man who let them on the plane or to each other. To Vincent, it was obvious they were following orders, which must have included keeping silent about what they were doing. The taller of the 2 men, 6 to 6'1", weighing 180 to 190 pounds, looked Latino. Vincent thought he was Cuban. The shorter man, 5'7" to 5'9", weighing about 150 to 160 pounds, was Caucasian. When Vincent watched the televised events from Dallas later that weekend, he recognized Lee Harvey Oswald as identical to the shorter man he had seen board the plane. Without ever having stopped its engines, the C-54 took off from the sandy area in a northwest direction. Carrying the man who looked like Oswald, the plane left Dallas far behind. And the jailed, about to be killed, Lee Harvey Oswald. So Lee Harvey Oswald that we know is in Dallas. Oswald number 2 is on this plane. A little after dusk, the C-54 landed on a runway. Going by what he was told at Andrews, Robert Vincent continued to think the plane's destination was Lowry Air Force Base in Denver. As soon as the C-54's engines were shut off, the 2 men in the cockpit emerged quickly. They rushed past Vincent out the door of the plane. The 2 passengers from Dallas hastened after them. Vincent was left alone in the aircraft, just as he had been at the beginning. That was strange. Very strange, Vincent said years later in an interview. I couldn't understand why they were in such a rush. They just bailed out. Robert Vincent descended from the plane into the gathering darkness. There was no one in sight. Nothing looked familiar. Across the runway, he could see a building with lights in it. Inside, he found a lone air policeman on duty. Hi, can you tell me where I am? You're at Roswell Air Force Base in New Mexico, the AP said. I thought I was going to Denver, Colorado. How can I get downtown and catch a bus? The air policeman told him he couldn't go anywhere because the base was on alert. No one could come in or go out. Vincent thought that was strange because the C-54 had just come in. How had their plane managed to enter a base that no one was allowed to enter? It didn't occur to him that the arrival of their plane could have been the reason for the base's closure to everyone else. That would explain why Vincent found the runway area deserted. At least one of the C-54 passengers was not supposed to be seen by anyone. But Vincent had seen him, and had even flown out of Dallas with him, even though he didn't know the significance of the man whom he had seen. The AP said there was nothing for Vincent to do except take a seat in the waiting room until the alert was lifted. After a couple of hours, the AP told him the alert was over and gave him directions to a bus stop. By the next morning, Saturday, November 23rd, Robert Vincent was at home in Colorado Springs, telling Roberta the story of his strange flight. Although they didn't understand what lay behind it, they both felt it could be dangerous. They agreed not to discuss it with anyone else. That night, while watching the TV coverage from Dallas, Robert shook his head in disbelief. He said to Roberta, "That guy looks just like the little guy who was on the airplane." "Are you nuts?" she said. "It couldn't be him. He's in jail." "I swear that's the little guy who got on the plane." "Well, keep quiet about it," she said. After Lee Oswald was murdered the following day, Robert Vincent kept quiet for 30 years about the little guy he saw get on a plane in Dallas. However, his silence could not erase the name and serial number he had given the airman at the Andrews check-in counter the morning of November 22nd. No doubt the 2 men who got on the plane in Dallas and the 2 in the cockpit were thoroughly debriefed. They would have referred to the other member of their team, a man as silently obedient to the plan as they had been, who was on the C-54 before any of them got on and until after they got off. One can imagine the debriefers' shock. What other man? The subsequent discovery that it was Air Force Sergeant Robert Vincent who was the unauthorized passenger led, the Vincents suspected, to the further developments that came about in their lives. In the spring of 1964, after Vincent was promoted to technical sergeant, a friend told Robert and Roberta that their neighbors were being questioned by the FBI about what kind of people the Vincents were and what they talked about. Not long after, Robert was ordered by his commanding officer to sign a new secrecy agreement. Roberta was also asked to fill out a personal history statement and sign a secrecy agreement, the first time she was ever required to do so as an Air Force wife. Y'all, this is fascinating. I normally stop more than this, y'all know, but this story is so riveting, don't you think? On November 25th, so 3 days after the assassination, Robert Vincent received orders to go to Washington, D.C. and report to a telephone number in conjunction with a special project. When he arrived in D.C. and phoned the number, he received instructions that resulted in his spending 5 days at CIA headquarters in Langley. The CIA put him through a series of psychological and physical tests, and at their conclusion, he was interviewed in a conference room by a half circle of men in semi-darkness. They asked Vincent to work for them. He refused, saying he wanted to retire from the Air Force and take a job in Colorado Springs. The CIA men offered him lucrative inducements, which he again refused. They finally let him go. As it turned out, they hadn't let him go at all. 3 months later, he was again to report to a telephone number, this time in Las Vegas, Nevada. The difference was that he was no longer being asked to work for the CIA. He was told to work for the CIA. The Air Force had reassigned him to a top-secret CIA project, the Blackbird SR-71 spy plane at an air base hidden in the Nellis Mountains, 40 miles northwest of Las Vegas. Later, the site was called Site 51. On his new assignment, he would soon learn that the CIA's projects out of Site 51 included experimental aircraft shaped like saucers. The same was true at the CIA's other base at Roswell, New Mexico, where the C-54 carrying the second Oswald had landed. Both Site 51 and Roswell were home to the flying saucers that people saw periodically in the area. They, in fact, came not from outer space, but from the CIA, which encouraged the flying saucer reports as a convenient cover story for the U.S. experimental aircraft. Yes, we have this all the time. And I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but every time there's some big news, like, for example, the man who was arrested for inappropriate behavior with underage girls for many years, who was friends with everybody. You guys know who I'm talking about. Well, every time there was news about him, his arrest, the supposed list of clients, anything having to do with that, or his co-conspirator who had a court case. Well, when you look at the dates of her court case, amazingly, those are the same dates when suddenly a spate of articles will come about where they're releasing all sorts of information about UAPs and UFOs and are we being visited from other worlds. They use this as a distraction. Or maybe not. Maybe you don't believe that. I do. I have started to notice when all of a sudden there's a big testimony in Congress, and it almost always happens at the exact same moment when there's some other news that they are trying to divert our attention from. So yeah, they use that as a cover story. They're like, sure, tell about flying saucers, then it'll kind of hide our work and we won't be under as much scrutiny. While he was working at Site 51, he saw a C-54 like the one that had flown the second Oswald out of Dallas. On its tail was the same rust-brown graphic of an egg-shaped Earth, crossed by white grid marks that he had seen on the C-54 he boarded. An Air Force sergeant confirmed. CIA. Although the CIA had paid him well to keep silent, when he retired in 1966, he and Roberta felt as if they had been freed from a plush prison. Out of fear for his life and concern for military retirement benefits, he maintained his silence during the 20 years he worked in Wichita, Kansas, first as an accountant, then as an administrative assistant and supervisor in the Wichita Public Works Department. In 1976, when he asked a lawyer friend in Wichita if he should reveal his secret, the lawyer said, "Don't tell a soul for your own safety." Yet Vincent's conscience continued to push him towards speaking. After Congress passed the JFK Records Act in 1992, mandating the disclosure of government records on the assassination, Vincent consulted with his member of Congress. Representative Dan Glickman of Wichita said, to his relief, that the new law freed him from his secrecy agreement when it came to assassination information. So on November 23, 1993, Robert Vincent told the story of his flight from Dallas to news anchor Larry Hatteberg on Wichita's Channel 10. Viewers gave, quote, an incredible response to Vincent's story, as they have to several reruns of it on the Wichita Channel. Vincent offered to testify before the ARRB, created by the JFK Act, that's the Assassination Records Review Board, but he was never called to do so. In 2003, a lawyer and a journalist co-authored their book, Flight from Dallas, describing Robert Vincent's experience in detail. On a Dallas map sent to him by Johnston, Vincent identified the C-54's landing area as the Trinity River floodplain just south of downtown Dallas. The particular location he marked out as the landing strip between Cadiz Street Viaduct and Corinth Street Viaduct was 4,463 feet long. A C-54 expert was consulted. He had flown on over 100 missions with the C-54 in response to the query of whether or not the C-54 could have done this. He said, "It's my personal opinion that a C-54 could easily have landed in the Trinity River floodplain and have taken off therefrom in the depicted area." Because of this CIA blunder, Robert Vincent's providential presence on this flight where the second Oswald fled from Dallas, it gives us the ability to see the planning for the Oak Cliff follow-up to the assassination. First, in Dealey Plaza came the killing of JFK by snipers firing from the grassy knoll and the Texas School Book Depository. Then, in Oak Cliff, the scenario continued with Oswald's escape in a taxi, while the second Oswald was driven into the same area in the Rambler station wagon by the man that Roger Craig described as a husky-looking Latin. This corresponds to Robert Vincent's description of the Oswald companion who got on the C-54, standing 6 to 6'1", whom Vincent said looked Latino. Officer JD Tippit was then shot to death by a man who witnesses said looked like Oswald. After Tippit's murder and Oswald's capture, in a shell game featuring the Oswald look-alike, he and his Cuban-looking companion flew out of Oak Cliff on the CIA plane. The C-54's landing strip by the Trinity River was on the perimeter of Oak Cliff, where the CIA plane taxied in a half circle and paused to pick up the second Oswald, and his Cuban-looking partner was 1.3 miles from El Chico's parking lot. The man, like Oswald, whom T.F. White saw sitting in the CIA-connected car on El Chico's lot at 2 p.m., was a 5-minute drive from the point where the CIA plane would meet him at 3:30 p.m. He had plenty of time to reconnect with his handler, change into a highway worker coveralls, and rendezvous with the C-54 while his more visible counterpart went to jail, and 2 days later, to his death. Robert Vincent has said that since November 22, 1963, every time I'd see an article on the assassination, I stop and wonder if I have the answer to this puzzle. Could this small piece of information fit into the larger picture to help us learn what happened? Thanks to the information presented by auto mechanic T.F. White and Mayor Wes Wise, concession stand operator Butch Burroughs, hobby shop owner Bernard Hare, and Air Force Sergeant Robert Vincent, we now have a larger picture of the way in which two men played the role of Lee Harvey Oswald in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas on the afternoon of November 22, 1963. The interlocking testimonies of Wise, White, Burroughs, Hare, and Vincent have given us a backstage view of the double Oswald drama directed by the CIA. So that is a look at, yes, Oswald's arrest, but also a deep dive into the second Oswald. I hope you guys are fascinated. I also am fascinated. Next time, come back. We are going to be getting into Robert Groden's book, The Search for Lee Harvey Oswald. We are going to look at Oswald's time in custody. So that time period between when he was arrested and when he went to his death. So that's the time we're going to be looking at next. What was done during that time? What documentation can be proven about what was said, what was done, what was filmed? We're going to get it all right here. I hope you'll come back for that next time. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I cannot wait to hear them. This reading really filled out my knowledge of the assassination, really gave me a more robust picture of the second Oswald. I hope you feel the same. I hope you have a great day chewing on all that good information. Bye.